Okay.
About
Did you have a chance to?
I don't know about you.
Hey, Steve. Let me welcome everyone to the first noon hour Greenbag lecture program for the Wallace Stegner Center for this spring semester here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. I'm Bob Kiter, the director of the Wallace Stegner Center. It's my privilege and pleasure to handle the introduction today and at most of our programs. A couple quick announcements of upcoming events before getting into my introduction. Our next Greenbag presentation will be the middle of February, actually February 14th, Valentine's Day. And we'll hear from Professor Jeremy Jackson, who is a professor of oceanography emeritus at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, also an emeritus senior scientist with the Smithsonian Institute. He'll be addressing the topic of breakpoint reckoning with America's environmental crisis. He also is appearing later on the 14th in the evening at the Natural History Museum at 6:30, where he'll give a public lecture on the oceans, humanity's evolving relationship to the ocean, revaluing the ocean. So that both of those are available on the 14th of February. I should also note, I'm afraid I don't have the precise date, but Professor Robert Bullard is here the end of January addressing the issue of environmental justice, and he'll be here at the Moot Court Room. Information on that's available both on the Stegner Center website and elsewhere on the university publicity sites. And then finally, in terms of upcoming events, March 21st and 22nd is the 24th Annual Wallace Stegner Center Symposium on the topic of recreational challenges on public lands. Sally Jewell, former Secretary of the Interior during the second Obama term, will be here as our keynote speaker. Registration is open electronically. Additional details are available on the Stegner Center website. For those of you familiar with our brochure for the symposium, we'll have that out shortly. A couple other miscellaneous matters. As many of you noticed, the King's English Bookshop is outside with copies of our speaker's books for sale today. He'll be happy to sign them and pick them up after we're finished. We'll pass a sign-up sheet around that will enable us to keep track of attendance and make sure that you get information about upcoming Stegner Center events. Silence the cell phones, and that, I think, takes us to acknowledging the sponsor and donor for today's event, and that's the Cultural Vision Fund, which has provided funds for this lecture, as well as a number of other Stegner Center lectures, our Visiting Scholar program, and our annual symposium. We're deeply indebted to the Cultural Vision Fund for its continuing support of Stegner Center programs. With that, we're pleased to have with us today a conservation photographer, author, and instructor, Dave Showalter, whose work focuses on the American West. Dave has published 2 books, Sage Spirit, The American West at a Crossroads, the basic subject of his talk today, and the award-winning book, Prairie Thunder, published in 2007 by Skyline Press. His photographs and articles have appeared in Audubon, Conservation Biology, Outside, Outdoor Photographer, High Country News, Colorado Life, and a number of other publications. He's a senior fellow photographer in the International League of Conservation Photographers, and his work, he does his work in conjunction with a number of conservation groups, including Audubon Rockies, the Wilderness Society, and the Sierra Club. We're very pleased to have Dave with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the very kind introduction. It's truly an honor to be here at the Stegner Center and to see what goes on here. Just had a wonderful tour of the facility. So great to be in Salt Lake and great to be with you folks. Yes, I'm focused on the American West. What is conservation photography? It's visual storytelling. That's what it is. It's what we're doing today, basically, creating images with intent and purpose to build a narrative, to advocate. In my case, to advocate for functioning ecosystems, for wildlife and people, and for conservation and community, and for our public lands. And if you're here, you probably are quite in tune with some of the threats we face today. But what I'd like to do is take you on a sagebrush journey, and I'd like to link prairie and sage and watershed and talk about some of those challenges we face. But first, an affirmation, just to set the tone, I think. We simply need that wild country available to us, for it can be a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanctity as creatures, a part of the geography of hope. Is it still the geography of hope? I feel like through my work, I'm always trying to answer that question. I sure hope so. And I go to the wilderness letter quite often to return to that quote. So my journey started 30 plus years ago. I moved from Illinois to Colorado for a corporate job. I met this wonderful young lady in the back here, Marla, my wife, and our adventures were all about climbing. So I had this corporate job, and we were climbing, and we were hiking the mountains, and just it was mountain, mountain, mountain. Everything was about the alpine zone, and it still is in a lot of ways. But when I got ready to start telling stories, I looked to the prairie. I felt like it was underserved photographically and from a story perspective. And so that's where I began, was on the Colorado prairie. And I did a project called Prairie Thunder, which was the eastern half of Colorado. And part of what really intrigued me was the idea that there was nothing out there. People said it was drive-through country. And that wasn't my experience at all. So, try this again. Here we go. So I needed a foundation for the project, and close to home was Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge. It's an urban refuge centered right in Denver. It was once called by Ken Salazar, when he was Secretary of the Interior, the most important urban wildlife refuge in our 550-some refuge system. And it's really close to home, and they have these enormous mule deer out there, and that's pretty neat. It's totally surrounded by city. Yet we were able to reintroduce bison in 2007, and today you can look at a wild bison herd with a backdrop of Denver in the Front Range. And they're a keystone species. They're doing really well out there. The range has been expanded on the refuge right next to Denver Airport. It's pretty crazy. Really cool stuff. And I did a scavenger study out there on a fallen bison. Found out that the magpies really took over. They sort of mobbed the carcass, and I would go through huge memory cards every other day from all the magpies tripping my camera trap. But then every once in a while, coyotes would show up, and the magpies would disperse. And I saw 6 different species on that carcass. But you could call the shortgrass prairie the prairie dog ecosystem easily, because 160 other creatures depend on prairie dogs for food and shelter through their burrowing activities. One of those creatures is the burrowing owl. Western burrowing owls don't dig their own burrows. They use abandoned prairie dog burrows to set up their nests and to raise their young. My very first biology study was a burrowing owl study, and now I go out with biologists as much as I can. I am neither a biologist nor a lawyer, but I hang out with a lot of really smart people that are engaged in these ecosystems, and so that was a good experience that I've built off of. And I did find out that if you're late to work, the owls will just take over your blind because it's the highest platform on the prairie, so don't be late to work. And that fire is a really great tool for conservation, particularly to get rid of invasive grasses and weeds so that you can encourage growth of natives. Black-footed ferrets have been reintroduced out there since. Our most endangered mammal, thought to be extinct as recently as 1979, when they were found, a small population was found near Meeteetse, Wyoming. So they've been brought out because there's a great prairie dog population at the refuge, and their primary prey item, about 98% of their diet, is prairie dogs. And that's why they're so endangered, is because prairie dogs are on 2% of their historic range. I ventured out from the Denver metro area to photograph greater prairie chickens in Yuma County, Colorado, on the very eastern end, pretty close to the Nebraska Sandhills. Set up on a private lands lek, working with Colorado Game and Fish. Had that experience of sitting in the cold and the dark and waiting, and you hear the birds and they're booming. It sounds like blowing over the top of a pop bottle, and you're just excited and you're ready to photograph, and here come coyotes. And so we had this Wile E. coyote moment, and I thought my day was going to be over, but coyote gave up, and I was able to make a few images that I really liked. And what I found out was I am really hooked on this lekking grouse experience, these birds that return to the same mating grounds year after year. And there's a number of grouse that do that in our neck of the woods, so plenty of opportunities. And what you find out on the prairie is that good grass is life. That's it. Just a lot of these creatures just need big expanses of good grass, whether private or public. So shifting gears, it wasn't really a big leap to go work in the sagebrush. A lot of the same critters, still drive-through country, right? Kind of overlooked and underrated and trampled upon. And so I started working on this sagebrush project, and the main reason for the project was I got this report from the Wilderness Society, and they still print it once a year. It's called Too Wild to Drill, and it lists places that are too wild to drill in North America. And I think there was 14 of them, and 12 of them were in the sage, and I thought, gosh, I could make a project out of that. And then I started the project and started networking and went to see Audubon Rockies, who had the best science for this ecosystem and for sage-grouse recovery, and they still do. And so developed really good partners. I didn't set out to do a sage-grouse book, but with Braided River, my publisher, we thought, we need to build this project around these charismatic characters, and so that was the approach we took. And it's still the way I tell the story. And I'm 10 years in on telling this story. Things have changed a lot, but an awful lot has stayed the same. So Braided River works in partnership with conservation groups. And what that amounts to is it's not a traditional book model. They publish a couple of conservation photography books a year, and then working with groups, we can get these books in the hands of Western governors. We have 9 of 11 Western governors in this geography right now that we're getting books to because they have no history on this issue with grouse and with sage and with this ecosystem, one of the most imperiled ecosystems on Earth. And so we build out these partners, and that's how we amplify our messages. So I applaud Braided River for their approach, and I'm so proud to work with them as a publisher. And in fact, right now we have a display at Denver International Airport on Concourse A that we put together that's both rivers and sage. So that's pretty neat for outreach. So the Oregon Buttes are quintessential sagebrush landscape. It's in the Red Desert of Wyoming. How many know where the Red Desert is? All right, this is the most of any group outside of maybe Rock Springs. So it's an enclosed basin, totally ringed by the Continental Divide. Water doesn't flow out, and it's all sage, and it's magical. And this is a wilderness study area. If you were traveling to Oregon in the late 1800s, you were halfway when you got here. It's extremely biodiverse and it's equally threatened. These lands in this Jack Morrow Hills area have been leased for oil and gas drilling before. Those leases expired, and I expect they'll be back again. So, wilderness study area. What is wilderness? Besides just the didactic explanation we give for what wilderness is it a feeling? Is it a place where if you get in trouble, you have to get yourself out? Is it an idea? I don't know. I can't explain it. I'm still trying to answer. But when you go up on top of the Oregon Buttes and you look over the largest unfenced area in the lower 48, you have a sense of wilderness just kind of envelop you. It's incredible. So I sure hope it stays like that. Public lands. Our public lands are mostly concentrated in the west. If you look at this map, it's not hard to understand how difficult it can be to explain from somebody back east what their public lands estate is like. You know, folks have a reference and it's national parks typically. And on this map, these slate blue areas are national parks. You can see they're pretty small in the mix. That's Yellowstone. And Yellowstone, this ecosystem isn't fully functioning. It needs, surrounding lands. It needs the BLM lands and the Forest Service lands to be able to breathe, because these are living, breathing organisms, these places. And so anyway, everything's stacked up in the west. Yellow is BLM. They're our biggest agency for public lands. Green is the Forest Service. The pink are Native American reservations. And then the slate blue is national parks, just to give you a reference. Squares and polygons aren't functioning ecosystems. And we need to see the West on a landscape scale. If we go to Antelope Flats in Grand Teton National Park on a fall morning, we can look at our national mammal roaming freely across the landscape beneath the Tetons. That's pretty magical. That's about as good as it gets on our public lands. And the area is so biodiverse, there's sage-grouse there too. I think of it as the most biodiverse place in the sagebrush ecosystem. I may be wrong, but that's how I view it. And folks from all over the world are inspired by our western wildlife and our open public lands, our open spaces. Part of our core values, right? Greater sage-grouse, our endemic western bird. They're often described as a chicken-sized bird that lives in sage. I don't know about you, leaves me a little flat. I think of them as noble and iconic and tough. As long as we give them habitat, they'll be just fine. They don't really need us so much. But today they need us an awful lot. We know them for their mating display, their spectacular mating display. These are males with their spiky tail feathers fanned, displaying for the attention of females. They're also one of the most studied birds in the world. We don't know everything about this creature. We know enough to give them a chance. We know enough to try to recover the species. That's the discourse we're having today, right now. How do we recover this species in light of the changes that have occurred? And we'll get into that in a minute. They're hardwired to sage. They spend their entire life cycle in sagebrush, this knee-high to waist-high old-growth forest. And these guys are fighting for survival to perpetuate the species. And there's tender moments on a lek or mating ground. Female gently raising her wings, signaling her readiness to mate. And notice there's another female, another hen behind the master cock, and she's waiting her turn, because one male does all or almost all of the mating on a lek. And I had the privilege this particular morning last spring of watching him mate time and time and time again at very close range from my blind set up on the big open Sagebrush Sea. So what I'd like to do now is ask you to imagine the smell of sage, that it's 15 or 18 degrees out, you've been sitting in the blind in the dark, you're cold, you haven't had any coffee, you're tired, and you're waiting. And then this happens. This is about a minute and 20 seconds. So that was about 6 hours on a lek, reduced to a little over a minute. It was actually 2 mornings. I've had only a couple of mornings in the last 5 years that were windless, where you could make video and actually have good sound. But it's stunning if you're sitting in the dark and you hear all of those swishes, baloops, pops, fighting. It's nuts. Our noble, iconic western bird. Please help me with that when you tell people about sage-grouse. They are sacred to Native people. Our western tribes dance for the sage-grouse. They do what they call a chicken dance. This is Jace, Old Coyote. He's an Arapaho Indian living on the Wind River Range, dancing on sacred ground. And he's doing the chicken dance, which is greater sage-grouse. You can't see it in this frame, but his tail feathers are sage-grouse tail feathers. Pretty cool. We knew over 100 years ago we were headed in the wrong direction with this species. William Hornaday, the great New York zoologist and conservationist, wrote his paper, Save the Sage-Grouse from Extinction, in 1916. That's when this photograph was made. And William Hornaday was warning us of hunting the creature to extinction, which was the case back then because these guys were feeding lots of mining crews and railroad crews as the West expanded. These are sage-grouse on the running boards and on the hood of a Model T Ford near Green River, Wyoming. These guys are just feeding their family. But I think it's pretty interesting to think that we've known for 100 years that we were already in decline with this species. Sally Jewell was mentioned. She was at Rocky Mountain Arsenal in 2015, flanked by governors, and when she made the announcement that the greater sage-grouse did not warrant listing and protection under the Endangered Species Act. And she went on to talk about the collaboration and the 10-year build-up to that listing decision and all the hard work that went into it, and how the Western governors and ranching and energy and conservationists and land management agencies all came together over a 10-year span using great science to create a plan for this species. And so out of that came this wonderful conservation plan that's sweeping. It's 11 states. It's 176 million acres or something. And it lasted 2 years. So that was that moment. And the moment we're in today is quite different. So today, our energy plan, which becomes our sage-grouse plan, is energy dominance. This isn't new. It was called American independence or something like that under the Clinton administration, energy independence. But we've not seen anything like this before, where we already have these mega fields that are industrial scale landscapes of energy development that they just eliminate any other use for the land. So we had that, but what we haven't seen before was these repeated unrelenting attacks on science and on public lands and on wildlife habitat, and you know the list. So these are pretty tough times. Do we just drill everywhere? Is that the plan? Are some places still too wild to drill? I think so. This is energy dominance just upstream from the Colorado River in western Colorado. This slide means the most to me for this part of the conversation because I've spent a few nights in gas fields just sleeping in my truck just to see what that experience is like. These places are never dark. They are never quiet. And the truck trips never stop. And it's really hard for wildlife. And we just can't have these giant mega fields every place. They're taking out sage-grouse rapidly wherever we develop. We eliminate sage-grouse because their lek fidelity is so strong that they return to the same lek year after year for millennia, and they use 4 or 4.5 miles in circumference around that lek for most of their life cycle. So if we go in and disturb that, then those birds just disappear. It's been hard on mule deer. On the Pinedale Anticline near Pinedale, Wyoming, that mule deer herd is down 60% since drilling began on their critical winter range a little over a decade ago. And we're seeing mule deer struggle elsewhere in northwest Colorado in the Pinion Basin, which used to be called the Mule Deer Factory, same kind of numbers. What the deal is when these mule deer set out to migrate on migrations that might be 20 to 150 miles long, they have stopover points. And they go through the gas fields, but they don't stop. They just keep going and going. And so we're losing mule deer. But not to totally pick on oil and gas, we need to be careful where we site everything. So our wind farms need to be sited properly. Development in the West is shrinking, so development in the West needs to be done carefully. And by viewing the land on a landscape scale, not in little boxes like we typically do. This is my one counterbalance slide. So the outdoor recreation industry is a $900 billion industry that supports 7 million jobs. And that's on par with oil and gas. So I think we ought to have a seat at the table and we ought to have a voice. But it's going to take all of us. There's 2 species of sage-grouse. The other one is the Gunnison sage-grouse. Up until 2001, they were all just called sage-grouse because these guys hadn't been designated yet. And there was this grouse in the Gunnison area of Colorado, which is kind of west central. And it's about 2/3 the size of a greater with broad white bands on their tail feathers. And they have very different vocalizations. They even do a little butt shimmy at the end of their display. And so they were designated a distinct and separate species in 2001. People knew immediately that they were probably endangered because there just weren't that many of them around. Eventually, I think it was, probably 5 years ago, they were given threatened status and protection under the Endangered Species Act. And about 86% of the birds are all in one basin. So they need that protection. This little video clip is just to show what it's like trapping or working with a trapped grouse in the middle of the night, and I'll explain in a moment. Some high-tech headlamp lighting there. But so Brooke and Jessica were collaring a male Gunnison sage-grouse to be relocated from an area where the population was doing pretty well into a satellite lek where there's very few birds and they're about to wink out. And there's a dozen of these satellite leks outside of the Gunnison Basin where the birds aren't doing very well. So that's a lot of the science that goes into trying to help out these Gunnison sage-grouse. The whole community's in on it. This is a Brownie Troop mural that says, "Please take care of our Gunnison sage-grouse." David Allen Sibley came to Gunnison because on his life list of North American birds, he had yet to see the Gunnison sage-grouse. It was his last bird on his North American life list. And so he had the same experience on the same lek that I've gone to a number of times. He went out actually with a biologist friend, sat in the front of the truck and was cold and listened to the birds come in and couldn't see them, that whole thing. And he started sketching madly and was so excited to see this last bird on his North American life list. And then a golden eagle came in and swept them all away and fledged all the birds. And he said, "What the heck happened?" Like all of us do that have done this for very long. So it made for a more rich story. But we were lucky. We were able to get David Allen Sibley to write our foreword and also to contribute this sketch for my book. So you can see those colors okay, it looks like. I'll spend a little time on this map. If we look at just the whole outline here, that's pretty much the Sagebrush Sea, or the sagebrush ecosystem. So that's our knee-high old-growth forest that covers our mountain valleys and basins. And then the kind of lilac part is so the outside, the pink part, or the peach part, is the historic range of greater sage-grouse. The lilac part is the current range of greater sage-grouse, which is 56%. And they used to number 16 million. Now there's 250 to 500,000 of the graders. And then in this Gunnison area, giving away. all my secrets. In this Gunnison area, this is Gunnison Basin, and these are some of the satellite leks in blue, and then in yellow is the historic range of these guys. There are a few birds in Utah, mostly by Monticello, and they're one of those satellite leks. So they number about 4,000 to 5,000 individuals, the Gunnison sage-grouse, and they're stable now. They're popular. They're no longer declining. Whereas the greater sage-grouse is still declining at 2% per year. We got to look at this whole business on a landscape scale. No longer in counties and conservation districts and states and all these squares and rectangles that we like to draw on maps. In our sagebrush ecosystem, there are 3 birds who are obligated to breed and raise their young in sage, so they're called sagebrush obligates. The Brewer sparrow on the left, they nest about the middle, the sagebrush sparrow on the left nests at the very bottom of the sagebrush, and the sage thrasher in the middle near the top, and the Brewer sparrow on the right-hand side kind of in the middle. The Brewers are our smallest sparrow, have this wonderful long song, and they're declining at 2 or 3% per year. And so that's paralleling the sage-grouse decline. And that's a big part of the reason that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service got so assertive with developing a plan for greater sage-grouse, because they saw other species coming up on the endangered species candidate list. Our greater sage-grouse are an umbrella species. If we protect habitat for greaters, we protect habitat for these guys and 350 other wildlife species. So biologist friend Tracy Johnson in the Pinedale Anticline with a sage thrasher chick studying the impacts of oil and gas on those guys. And so this ecosystem is so rich, it just holds all the wildlife of the West pretty much, from our mountain bluebirds to our western burrowing owls in the Kilpecker sand dunes, horny toads they're called, the greater short-horned lizard, biological popcorn on the forest floor. They're about this big on the forest floor of our sagebrush forest. Bison, our national mammal, drop their calves in spring in sage in Yellowstone. And biologists say that for 11 months out of the year, moose eat the box, and for 1 month they eat the cereal. And the cereal is bitter brush in the sage. And all these animals need freedom to roam. A single Yellowstone grizzly bear needs about 400 square miles, and they'll use everything from sage to high alpine when they're eating army cutworm moths at the end of summertime. So they use everything in the ecosystem. They need a lot of freedom to roam. So do elk and all the migrating ungulates. Here, elk are just pouring out of the gravelly range west of West Yellowstone along the Madison River to get to more wind-blown flats where they can forage and survive winter's race against time. And it's the same with mule deer and pronghorn and the other ungulates. On the path of the pronghorn in Grand Teton National Park, so that the pronghorn you see on Antelope Flats in summer, they have to migrate. They can't stay there because the snow gets too deep and they won't survive. So locals say that after the second big snow of October, they start to move. And where do they go? They start heading up the Gros Ventre. And the Gros Ventre is the river that goes, I guess it's east of Jackson Hole. And so they start here, and they follow the Gros Ventre River up, and they go up over a low alpine pass and onto the upper Green River Basin. So it's roughly a 160-mile migration for these pronghorn, where they'll pass through pinch points, where you see on the right-hand side of the frame public lands, and on the left-hand side private lands. And can you see these marks along the right here? This is the migration path, the ancient 7,000-mile path of the pronghorn, which is the only nationally protected or federally protected national migration corridor in the whole public land system. And then they got to get back in spring to Teton so they can drop their fawns and raise their young on Antelope Flats. So it's really important that we give these guys freedom to roam. And bighorn sheep are no different. The East Yellowstone bighorn sheep will leave the park in autumn, and they'll start heading down the North Fork of the Shoshone for rut, mating season, and they'll spend winter down there where it's not such deep snows. We have wonderful avian migrations. Our Rocky Mountain sandhill crane population overwinters at Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in the northern Chihuahuan Desert in New Mexico. And on a warm spring wind in late February, they'll take off and they'll start migrating. And they're heading for Greater Yellowstone. They'll get to Greater Yellowstone. Some will stop in northwest Colorado and disperse throughout the ecosystem, set up nests, and raise their young. So these guys are with 2 colts. You can see the colts right there. And those colts have to get big enough, almost the size of the adults, to fly back again in autumn. So it's really important that we protect these migration corridors and that, for instance, the sandhill cranes, they really need stopover points along the way, which requires us to give them food and water and a little space. We're all part of a watershed, right? Where does your water come from? Wasatch. But for this project, a lot of the project is in the Colorado River watershed, and I'll also drop that I'm currently working on a Colorado River watershed project, so I'm kind of linking Sage and watershed that way. But isn't it interesting that the river that carves the Grand Canyon, if we think of the Green River as the major tributary, and it is, the river that carves the Grand Canyon starts as a river of ice. So we're looking at Gannett Peak, the highest peak in Wyoming, 13,804 I think it is, with glacier fields all around it. And then the water flows out of those glaciers, it goes to Peak Lake for the Colorado River, and the Green River flows out of Peak Lake below Sulphur and Stroud Peaks, and then past Square Top Mountain, and it flows out of the Wind River Range out onto the Sage. And when it gets out, it hits that high desert sagebrush, that arid ecosystem. This is in Sage-grouse National Wildlife Refuge, not very far from here, 2.5-hour drive, I think. See Utah fishermen over there all the time. But at Sage-grouse, now you have this riparian area running right through the dry sage ecosystem. And it's amazing. The name Sage-grouse means in Shoshone, river of the prairie hen. And sage-grouse go to the river. Here these guys are lined up along the rim of the river, and they're going to fly over the river and spend the whole day eating in a wet meadow on the other side of the river. Interestingly enough, with bald eagles right over their head. I don't know why they do that. Maybe they're not that visual. Maybe they don't see the bald eagles. And then the females bring their broods to the refuge in late spring and early summer. In the middle is the hen, and she's got 2 of her chicks with her. So by the time they're 5 or 6 weeks old, they're almost as tall as she is. And they've been eating insects and forbs, and they're starting to eat sagebrush leaves. This refuge holds 300 trumpeter swans in winter and 8 to 10 nesting pairs through the summer breeding season. River otters are an indicator of water quality. It was minus 24 degrees when I made this image. Didn't affect the otters at all. But it's nice to know that they're there. That means the water quality is pretty darn good. Rough-legged hawks make a journey from the Arctic. They spend breeding season in the Arctic in northern Alaska down to our sagebrush and our prairies. Big open landscapes just like the Arctic tundra. Common creatures like the marsh wren flitting about the wetland, protecting his nesting territory. Prairie falcon on a bluff over the river, like 80 feet above the river. And what she would do is she would fly up above and she would bring back a chipmunk or a ground squirrel. So she's using the sage while nesting over the river. So we don't need to see these as separate ecosystems. It's all the same thing, and the animals tell us so. And bobcats, I spent about a week looking for these bobcats and found them towards the end of my trip last summer. And she had 3 kittens with her, presumably using that den. I went back in the fall to see if they were in that den area, and there was a pack rat poking his head out of that den, so she had obviously moved on. But what a great thing to see a bobcat at close range at sunset like this. And songbirds like yellow warblers in the coyote willow. And fish, these aren't native fish. They are kokanee salmon, which are basically landlocked sockeyes, but they run up from Flaming Gorge and spawn. And so you have these like curves around the river where you just see red in the river. And they die there, and they leave a whole lot of biomass for all the creatures that feed on dead things along the river. There is hope. Never believe that a few caring people can't change the world, for indeed, that's all who ever have. Margaret Mead. One of those people is Heather Sterling. She has the Elk Head Ranch in northwest Colorado, 9,600 acres. She's a Sage-grouse Initiative rancher. Sage-grouse Initiative is a government program that helps ranchers put conservation easements on their ranches when they have sage-grouse on their land. And her whole ranch is under conservation easement, except for a little patch of potatoes for vodka. And she's a really neat lady. And she said, you know, Dave, what I do here is I raise cattle, but what I really do is I grow birds. And she has 4 species of grouse on her ranch and nesting sandhill cranes, and it's really a wonderful spot. The Elk Head Ranch. Dan Smitherman is in Bondurant, Wyoming. He was an outfitter when someone told him that you might as well give up. The Noble Basin, the Upper Hoback are going to be drilled, Dan. And this whole area, back here behind the riders, was leased to be an industrial scale gas field. And this guy told Dan it was hopeless, and Dan, who is a Marine, said, we'll see about that. He later told me, I don't know the meaning of the word can't. And he marshaled some resources, and he brought folks together, and 60,000 people wrote letters, and they went to public meetings, and this was just a true grassroots, blue-collar effort. And this is up against the Wyoming Range. So the namesake range, the whole business was protected under the Wyoming Range Legacy Act, except for this part that was leased improperly in the southern Greater Yellowstone. And the thing got dragged out because all these people were submitting their public comments and going to meetings. And then grizzly bears moved in, so then the environmental impact statement was no good because now we had an endangered species at the time. I guess they were returned to endangered species status. But we had an endangered species on the land, so a new environmental impact statement needed to be done. Then one day, Trust for Public Land came in, and they bought those leases. And they gave the land back to the American people. And it's just a stunning conservation victory against the backdrop of where we're at today. So that's what's possible with grassroots conservation. Really, it's just super rewarding to be a part of that. One more. So there was to be a dam, the Echo Park Dam, right here. This is Steamboat Rock. Green River comes in here, joins the Yampa, and becomes the Green. So right here in this Precambrian rock, there was to be a dam. And in the 1950s, there was a lot of pushback. Sierra Clubs, David Brewer, Howard Zonizer of Wilderness Society led an effort. And what they really did was they took it to the American people and they said, do you value wilderness? Paraphrasing. And people resoundingly said, yeah, we value wilderness and we want to protect this place. And ultimately it got protected, and from that came the it's the Rivers Act that does not allow dams in national parks or national monuments. And so not only is Dinosaur National Monument free of a dam, but so are all these other national treasures. Grassroots conservation. The ground on which we stand is sacred ground. It is the blood of our ancestors. We could use a little of that today. What is sacred? And are we willing to accept that we'll just cut Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument? We're still litigating that, right? Or Bears Ears, will we just slash 86% of Bears Ears with the greatest wealth of ancestral Puebloan ruins on Earth? Will we just let sage-grouse fade away? What do? We have no choice. We have to resist. We have to push back. We need to engage with conservation. with good conservation groups that are doing good work so they can continue doing good work. And there's great work going on today. We have to defend the Endangered Species Act. That's done some, we wouldn't have black-footed ferrets or bald eagles or maybe grizzly bears in the lower 48, save for the Endangered Species Act. We need to uphold the Greater Sage-grouse plan. This plan only needed 2 more years to find out how we're doing. We're going to have a gauge in 2020. All the state plans rolled up into the federal plan, and now the states are each doing whatever they want to do. I did read some encouraging stuff from the new Wyoming governor today that he intends to honor the good work, the mitigation work for oil and gas development in his state, in Wyoming, which holds 38% of the birds. So we need to hold these 9 new Western governors accountable. That's our job today. We need to stand for our public lands. Every one of us is a deed holder to these public lands. And protect clean air and water. Whenever I get into one of these things with somebody who wants to debate me about some of these issues, I'll just ask them, are you for clean air and water? Maybe we can just start there. I believe we all agree on 85% of the same stuff. So let's let that guide our dialogue and not start with the things that we disagree on. We need to write, call, lobby, post, go to public meetings, engage, and vote. Sometimes in conservation we get bucked off. But nobody in this sagebrush, sage-grouse conservation world is giving up. I want to believe that the West is still wild enough to hold a gray wolf and a greater sage-grouse in a small space of a giant outsized landscape. That this is still the geography of hope. Thank you.
Time for some questions.
Describe your equipment that you're photographing.
Describe my equipment. So I shoot mostly Nikon. But like that fish picture I shot with a GoPro on 2 long sticks taped together. So, you do what you need to do. I've used a drone, a small Phantom drone for aerial stuff. I fly with Lighthawk. You see their name up above. Lighthawk is a conservation group of volunteer pilots, and they're just wonderful to work with, and they fly me wherever I need to go to tell these stories. That's how I made those headwaters of the Green River pictures. But yeah, I have some good Nikon cameras, and a lot of lenses from 600 millimeter to really short 16 millimeters. And yeah, I think about equipment that everything's good enough to make publishable images and to make impactful images, and I think we can all do that. I think we can do it with our phones. I think if we go out and we make some of these images with our phones and just in our ramblings, we ought to be able to say something about a place or a creature when we share with friends or when we go to Instagram or Facebook and caption things well and tell a story. We can all be storytellers, and which makes us advocates for this ecosystem or for the places that we care about. Maybe it's the national monuments in southern Utah. That's noble work, but we all have something to say. And so I'd like to encourage you to do that. Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't help noticing on the map that the Escalante area is a historic range and not a current range. Do you have any idea why
Well, no. Ecologically, I would say that, we've heard stories when we're in. The question is, why aren't there sage-grouse in Grand Staircase Escalante if it was on the map of the historic range? So we've heard accounts from locals that grass used to be waist high in Grand Staircase Escalante. There's not much sagebrush there now. It's been super hammered by grazing. The short answer is there just probably isn't suitable habitat, but I don't know beyond that. There's so many things. If we build anything too close to a lek, run a road through it, even a bike path, then we're going to lose birds. So all grouse need, whether they're Gunnison or graders, is big open expanses of sagebrush that's not fragmented. So that's it. Yes, ma'am. Is sagebrush in northern Utah invasive? I've never heard that before. Certainly, northern Utah is in the sagebrush ecosystem. Sagebrush does disperse. The seeds get spread. What makes sagebrush go is a wet spring and snow that lingers so that those seeds can take hold and germinate. In these arid climates, we're on like 90-year cycles or more to recover sagebrush. It really has a tough time taking hold. So I don't know about the invasive part. I do know that the Ute people like to burn white sage. Where does that come from? I don't know, but they don't burn the Wyoming big sagebrush that is so dominant in this ecosystem. Any more questions?
Walk us just briefly through how you select the sites to photograph, and then just sort of the logistics of getting there, and a day or a night in the day out in your blind.
So the logistics of photographing sage-grouse?
Yeah.
So if I want to photograph sage-grouse, I'll come up with a little checklist of things in my head, of things that I want. So 5 years ago, I went to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and I said, I'm looking for a really scenic place. I don't want to see any people, but I want it to be fairly easy to get to. I had this long list, and the biologist kindly met me and took me out, showed me where it was. It's just you look from your vehicle and you go, there's nothing out there. It's just sagebrush. But you walk. I walked a mile out with him, and there was two just areas that rose up not much above the surrounding landscape. And it must have been more alkali soil or something because there wasn't as much sage. So they're kind of open. They're a little bit raised. So that tells me that, that helps them to see predators approaching. Biologist left. I go to my truck and get my blind and walk that mile again and set up my blind. After wandering all over the place because I'd already lost the location because I didn't mark it properly. I look for sage-grouse castings or poop, and where there's a heavy concentration of them, I figure that's a good place to start. And then I set up. I don't want the shadow of my blind blocking the grouse, so I orient so that when the sun comes up, I won't have a shadow falling over the lack. All these things go into consideration, and then depending on where I'm at, if I think the birds if somebody's told me they're roosting overnight near the lek, I'll go climb in my blind the night before, and I'll just sleep in the blind so I don't disturb the birds. Otherwise, I'll get up at about 3 or 3:30 a.m., I'll sleep in my truck, and then I'll go out there in the dark and I'll climb in and I'll just sit and wait. And then you stay. There's a whole bunch of ethics that go with it. You don't make any noise, and you don't stick anything outside of the blind, and then you stay until all the birds have left for the day. So sometimes you'll have a couple of knucklehead males that just won't leave. And it'd be like 10:30 in the morning, and you're going, "Come on, guys! I'm getting hungry here." Or you might have the golden eagle come along, and your day might be over before the sun even comes up. Thanks for that question. One more? Yes, sir. What are my thoughts on juniper pinion chaining to restore sagebrush? I know it's super sensitive. However, juniper has encroached in places where historically it didn't exist. And in some cases, it's the only hope. My short answer is always let science guide these things. And if science says in order to recover the species, we need to remove some juniper, I'm okay with it. And I've seen the data in places, Sage-Grouse Initiative data, in places in Utah and Nevada where the results are very promising from removing junipers. So that said, I'm not intimately familiar with what impacts chaining has on the surrounding environment when removing these trees. So I'd say if science, tells us we need to take out some trees, fine, but we need to do it in a responsible way. So, sorry, I feel like I've been engaged in one way or another in just about everything that's going on in this ecosystem, but not juniper removal. So, thanks for the question. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you again.
My pleasure.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. Let me remind you, on Valentine's Day, noon, lecture by Jeremy Jackson on the environment generally, Day of Reckoning. And he'll also be heard from at the Museum of Natural History at 6:30 that evening. And also the end of this month, we'll be hosting Dr. Robert Bullard here on the subject of environmental justice. So please join us. Thanks again. And Dave will be signing books outside. Be clear about that. You might want to slip out there
I'm
just
going
to
to
be available.
Yeah. I'm going to grab
Get short stuff.
Just grab this.
Yeah.